We'll start a minute early. That's the new British we're doing. So, welcome everybody. My name's Torsten Bell. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the director of the Resolution Foundation, and you're very welcome here today. We apologise for the venue, which is very grand, but isn't our normal venue due to not only are we leaving the European Union, but it turns out that you can also flood basements in Westminster very easily. We'll be back there shortly. Now, this is an event to discuss the early impact of the national living wage on jobs, on prices, on profits, and what the effect of Brexit has been, / will be, maybe will be in the future. And in some ways, this event is, if you think about the film Titanic, and you think back to the first half of that film, everyone's very worried about boy meets girl, social class structures of cabins, what's going to happen. And that is kind of the national living wage debate we were having until about the 23rd of June. Which was, is anyone going to lose their jobs? What's going to happen? Lots of scare stories, lots of people saying, relax, history shows you this. And that was about as scary as British politics and British economics got. Now, I'm not saying we've definitely hit an iceberg, but we're definitely at the stage where we've something's made a big noise, and people are starting to wander around the ship working out whether there's a hole or actually we're still cruising on course. So because the national living wage was a big issue, it is now a different issue amongst a much more uncertain politics and economics. And so we should get into both halves of that discussion. Now, to help us do that, we have Helen Dickinson, who is the Chief Executive of the British Retail Consortium, recently OBE. Congratulations, I think. Not?
Thank you. Yes. Should we mention that? Yes.
Should we? Okay, well, right. Conor Darcy is a policy analyst at the Resolution Foundation and has written the report that we'll be discussing shortly. Kaylee Hignell is Head of Policy Assistance Advice, and we'll also be showing you some slides of some recent work they've done about what people coming into assistance advice are raising about the national living wage. And Jonathan Porters is the Principal Research Fellow at the National Institute, who led a lot of the attempt to inform the economics debate during the recent referendum campaign. They're going to touch specifically on how the post-Brexit world could look like and what the impact of that is on the national living wage. And then we'll get through those, and then we'll get as much time as we can for your questions and others. So, Conor, you're going to kick us off with a brief presentation. Yes. If you can get this there as well.
So, I'm not sure if it beats Torsten's Titanic film reference, but my reference here is 28 days later. We're 100 days since the national living wage was introduced, and judging by some of the reaction before the policy came in, you could think that the world was about to end. We had some very violent headlines around killing jobs, destroying jobs, crippling cost of the national living wage. So there was definitely concerns around there. So we always knew that lots of workers were going to be better off because of the national living wage. But one big question was, what were employers going to do? So even though it's early days, we've taken a look at some of the kind of initial signals, what we can tell about what employers have done. So we can look at early employment data. The most detailed one is a bit of a lag of where it comes out, but we can get a lot of good information from what we've got so far. We can look at business confidence surveys to see how employers are feeling. Frequently the national living wage comes up as an issue. And we also commissioned a bespoke survey by Ipsos Mori, talking to 500 employers, asking have they been affected, and if so, how have they reacted, and how do they plan to react in the future. So, if we look first at employment data, we can see that obviously one of the big stories of the post-recession period has been employment reaching record highs, and it's continued to rise and rise. But what we've seen in the last few months is this sort of plateau period where it's kind of started to flatten out. So we haven't seen the employment rate dropping by any means, but that kind of meteoric rise that we'd seen beforehand has slightly slowed down. So there might be some evidence potentially that the national living wage has kind of contributed to that. We've seen the employee numbers plateau while self-employment has actually continued to keep rising, and obviously self-employed aren't entitled to the national living wage. That might be one way of getting around the national living wage. But when we look at the kind of employees who are more likely to be on the national living wage, when we look at their employment rates, so if we talk about female workers as opposed to male workers, we've seen quite a similar pattern. Part-time, full-time, part-timers are much more likely to be on low pay. We haven't seen any bigger shifts there. There is one kind of trend here where temporary workers who are more likely to be low paid, we have seen more of a drop in their employment rate. But in some ways that's quite a positive thing. Lots of people aren't very happy being in temporary employment, are seeking permanent roles. So I don't think there's much evidence here to suggest that the national living wage has really contributed to that plateauing. What about business confidence surveys? National living wage did come up in a few of them, and I should mention that this is all pre-Brexit. I'll come on to the kind of post-Brexit impacts as much as I can afterwards. But what we've seen is that there was definitely concerns in the run-up to the referendum about the uncertainty that was bringing. The national living wage did feature as something else that employers were considering and was affecting some of the decisions they were making. I think it's kind of a smaller overall impact, and we wouldn't suggest that it really explains a lot. So those are some of the kind of the early signals. But what about the survey? So the survey allows us to really kind of get into depth on some of these issues. It doesn't let us say what's going on in one sector as opposed to another, but it does tell us the kind of share of firms have been affected. So this is kind of a follow-up to some work that we did with the CIPD in earlier this year. So a survey we carried out then in September, so after the policy had been announced, but before it had been implemented, found that most employers, the most common response was to try and raise productivity. So that was positive. But we also found that about half of them reckoned that they wouldn't be affected by the national living wage at all. And that is borne out again in this. We find about 35% overall say they've already been affected, their wage bill, by the national living wage. And only 6% say that it's been a large effect on their wage bill. So we've got another 16% who expected to start to hit their wage bill as the national living wage rises higher. But we've got another 43% who think it will never impact on them. They just pay higher wages and it will never start to influence them. So we know that there's a minority affected. How have that about 1 in 3 employers decided to respond to these higher wage costs? And unlike last time, where employers were quite keen on raising productivity, we actually see that increasing prices has been the main response that employers are taking, along with taking lower profits. So I think the way to kind of slightly characterize this is they're taking a sort of a suck and see approach. It's early days, there's lots of uncertainty around with lead up to the referendum, and these two responses are slightly easier. They don't require big shifts in your business model or really kind of any serious changes in your approach. So they've been passing the cost of higher wages onto either consumers or onto the ownership of the company. We've also seen some of those productivity enhancing ones, but it's not the top answer anymore. We do see some of these issues like asking workers to do more, and that more can mean more complex roles, more working more hours, or just looking at job design, thinking about the kind of tasks that employers do. Investing more in training is also up there, 15%, and investing more in technology. Now what about the concerns about job losses? Well, on the basis of this survey, it looks like those were overplayed. We've got 14% of employers here responding that they've used less labour. And just to clarify, that doesn't mean that they've just sacked people. We've also included in that option is they've offered fewer hours, or even just slowing recruitment. There is a kind of a mix there. So we shouldn't overplay the job cuts fears. Obviously it does, some people will be affected by that, and Katie will tell us a bit more about those people who've been coming into citizens' advice. But I think overall those fears are overstated. Another big topic has been reducing other perks of the job, things like paid breaks or and holiday pay, and only 8% of firms say that's been one of their main responses. And similarly, hiring more workers aged 25 and under hasn't really shown up as a big response. So that's what they've done so far. But what about the next 5 years? So we asked them, you've got the national living wage coming in, you've also got the apprenticeship levy, auto-enrollment, pensions, and some other kind of things that are raising labour costs. So kind of the era of cheap labour potentially is drawing to a close. So what's he planning to do over the longer run? Prices still stay top, so again I think there will be some knock-on to customers. But again, some of these more productivity enhancing responses do rise up. We see asking workers to do more, investing more in training, more technology, they kind of rise up the charts. But we do also see hiring more workers aged 25 and under is also on the list. So I think this is, as employers are starting to think through the range of responses that are available to them, kind of making more long-term decisions within. But that was all pre-Brexit, and that obviously has changed the game for many employers. So, I mean, in some ways it just kind of adds to the scenario that I've already mentioned, this kind of rising of labour cost. We might potentially see if migration from EU countries falls, there are fewer workers to to choose from, and that might mean that wages do end up being pushed up. I've just picked a selection of sectors here where the blue bar shows you the share of EU migrants as their total workforce within those sectors, and also the probability of computerization, so how easy would it be potentially to start to bring in more technology into those industries. So it's these kind of thoughts around how am I using my labour, what are my best kind of resources, how do I balance that trade-off in the future that I think some industries in particular are really going to have to think through. But I guess it does also raise bigger questions around the kind of trajectory of the rate and how exactly, what it means to workers. So the £9 figure has been much discussed. £9 in 2020 has been kind of the ambition for the national living wage. But that's actually meant to represent 60% of what a typical worker earns rather than that specific cash figure. So, you know, there's lots of uncertainty around wages, around earnings, around inflation, so we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. But using some analysis performed by a team at NISR, they've looked at how wages are expected to grow, how inflation is expected to change as a result of the of Brexit. And what we find is that on some of these scenarios, the actual real value of the national living wage might be lower than we expected beforehand. Again, this is mostly higher inflation doing a lot of the work rather than wages falling or anything like that. So there is this question around how it goes forward. And I think, just to sum up, there's little evidence of the national living wage costing jobs to date. Majority of employers unaffected, and only a small percentage have faced a really large wage bill increase. In profits and prices that are doing most of the work, but productivity enhancing ideas are definitely on the minds of employers. But as we heard, as I mentioned with the survey that we did in September, firms were very, the most common response was to raise productivity. But what we've seen subsequently is that the main response has actually been to raise prices. So even though employers might have good intentions on these things, it's not straightforward. There's no productivity lever that you can just pull. So I think helping firms to think through the options, I think, is a really important role for government. On Brexit, it really does bring uncertainty, what happens next with the national living wage. But as that uncertainty grows, I think the role for the Low Pay Commission is really important. They have stewarded the national minimum wage since it came in the late 90s. I think they're really well positioned to take a look at how the national living wage is affecting the economy, and they're a really useful voice for government to ensure that the national living wage helps employees while not disadvantaging employers. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Connor. You're the second mate or whatever they call it on the boat who's like gone and had an early look and been like, it kind of looks alright so far. They're fingers crossed. Right. Okay, let's have all the people staying on the ground and it's a nice sentence.
Okay, thanks, Austin, and thanks, Connor. Okay, so firstly, just thought it would be useful to talk about what I'm going to say. So we're going to touch on our inquiry data, what we're seeing at Citizens Advice on the ground, obviously very early days. Have a look at some advisor polling that we've done to get a bit more detail of that reaction, and then look at some of our wider work on income security and how this might look through. So, Citizens Advice for people who aren't aware of us or haven't worked with us. We have offices across the country. We cover 2,900 locations, and we see 2.7 million people, about 6.2 million issues. They range really from things like benefit, debt, immigration, housing, relationships. I could go on. It's pretty much everything that people come to see us about. That reach and that volume allows us to really quickly understand how policies are interacting on the ground, what's not working, what is working, what unexpected consequences may there be of different policies. So in reflection of that, we monitor what's coming through our doors day to day, what kind of things people are coming to us about. And we've been doing this following the referendum, so we've got every day what issues come up, and trying to keep on top of that just to see exactly where people may need our help and exactly what policy changes we might be calling for. We've been doing this for policies like universal credit, we're also doing it for the national living wage. Obviously, with the national living wage, it's a welcome pay rise for most of our clients. Something up to 6 million people by 2020, and many of our clients will be in that 6 million, so it's a good policy in our eyes, but it is a one-size-fits-all policy, and we do see much variation in the labour market, whether it's businesses, business models, employees or workers, so you would expect to see different reactions in relation to the policy as a result of that. Our clients typically are lower income, and they typically are coming to us with problems, even potentially problems with employers. So it's really important to see our findings in the context of what might be perceived as the sharp end of the labour market rather than the labour market as a whole. So we asked our advisors in a bit more detail about what they were seeing, because on our actual inquiry data, we're not seeing a huge rise in the amount of people coming to us in comparison to national minimum wage. So we haven't seen an influx of people all of a sudden going, hold on, what's happening with this policy? We've seen slight numbers, but we're talking in the low hundreds here, not in the thousands. And considering we're seeing like 80,000 employment inquiries a quarter, that really is like not a significant change. Wanted to know a little bit more about that detail though, even though it's low numbers, just to see what might be coming up next around the corner. So we polled our advisors, over 200 of them across the country, and asked them quite a lot of things about workforce shape. Are people not hiring? Are they hiring on 25s? Are they requiring people to become self-employed? Things around hours, so cuts to hours, changes to how hours are specified in contracts. And then obviously pay and benefit packages, so additional benefits you might get like store discounts, even detail around pay grades, pay increments, all of those things. Went into quite a level of detail with them. We did this in March 1st, just as a kind of, it's about to happen. We were starting to see people trickle through our doors at that point. We repeated this in June again to see if that would, if there was any difference, if reaction was changing. And we're going to be doing this over the next couple of quarters as well. So we're very much at a halfway point here of this research for us. It's early findings in that context. So what did we see? So basically advisors told us very much that what they were seeing was an increase in inquiries relating to people who had their hours cut. So that was around non-contracted hours and also contracted hours. Interestingly, those were at almost the same level of change. This is in comparison to March. And what we're not seeing is all of that being loaded onto non-contracted hours workers, so your 0 hours workers, for example. Perhaps because employers are trying to remain with some flexibility as they come up to kind of wider challenges in the economy. We also saw people having removal of their specified hours of work from contracts, so that's your contract saying you're working Tuesday, Wednesday and Friday. That's particularly important for people who have kind of caring responsibilities, particularly in childcare, where they're having to arrange quite costly solutions to allow them to work. And quite worryingly, we also saw an increase in the amount of people, advisors telling us about self-employment being required. This is a bit of an alarm bell for us at Citizens Advice. We've done quite a lot of work around bogus self-employment. A contract that used to be employed and now is required to become self-employed is almost by definition something that is going to be bogusly self-employed. So we are quite worried about that. Some of the things that dominated the headlines around kind of like overtime pay, antisocial hours pay, we saw much less growth or even actually decreases. So incremental pay rises, that was going down between March and June. Stuff around changes to pay grades or pay bands was also changing, and bank holiday pay again going down. What's important to take from this is that we're not seeing something where people are standing still. Possibly because our clients work for employers who have tighter margins and having to remain much more fleet of foot with this kind of policy, and obviously with wider context as well. So we're seeing between March and June a fair amount jostling around for position around these different factors. I have to be really clear and repeat again, this is not implying this is a scale issue, but just what we think is happening at the sharp end of the labour market. We think that quite a few of these things link into kind of wider issues around income security that we've been doing a lot of work on at Citizens Advice. Effectively, things like having your hours cut, things like your schedule of hours and when you're going to be working can leave a lot of people feeling quite insecure. At Citizens Advice, we've done quite a lot of polling around this recently. So this is a poll that we've done with comrades to understand a little bit more about what security means to people. So this is polling over 2,000 people, and as you can see, like having a steady income comes out way above everything else here as something that's so important. So it's not just the level of pay, but how steady and secure that income is what matters to people. Interestingly as well, we also asked about non-job factors. This is very much the job factors up here. So things like interest rate rises, waiting lists for NHS, pensions, all of those things that can at some time or another dominate headlines. by and large, job security was by far leading the pack here in terms of having a very big impact. Those kind of things either were in the low percentage of insecure or in neutral, to be honest, compared to these kind of things. What's also quite interesting as well is it's not just like headlines around pay or even steady income that are in this. Some more detailed things about how jobs are designed and how some of the experiences work and have such a large impact on people and security. Having a look there on the fifth one down, having a good relationship with your line manager, dominating that there, which is quite interesting really. We don't really think of that in terms of security. Other things like having no sick pay or having no paid annual leave coming up quite high on the impact on insecurity. These are smaller details and sometimes we forget these when we're looking at big picture macroeconomy policies. We also know that security can have a big impact on how stressed people feel, how they're able to cope with that stress, for employers, how loyal people are to their employers, and more importantly, even more so in changing context at the moment, 83% of people said to us that having a steady income increases their productivity. Obviously this is central to most of the labour market policy that we will be looking at in the coming months, if not years, to be totally frank. Just to kind of wrap up then, and to bring it back to the national living wage, as you can see, level of pay here is quite important to people when they're looking for a job, but it's as important, or if not more important, is whether that pay is a steady income. At Citizens Advice, we think that the UK needs to have a two-pronged approach when it comes to this. We need to work on pay level, but we also do need to ensure that that income is steady. At the moment, there's a bit of a gap there in policy and how that might work. Thank you.
Great. Now, the BRC is in some ways, you're at the sharp end of the national living wage anyway, it's one of the most affected sectors, and you're also the kind of the pinch point where consumer confidence, any change in it post-Brexit, is likely to manifest itself faster. Maybe buying houses is different, particularly, but more in the real world and more generally. So what do you think is going on?
Well, I think we've got three things going on basically. So we'll come back to Brexit in a minute. But even before we start talking about the living wage, I think the thing that's really important in the context of the retail industry is to get an understanding of how much it's changing. So the way that we all shop is fundamentally transforming. If you think about yourselves and what you might do, the growth of online, this is shifting the structure of the industry that was happening before we even got on to the impact of the national living wage. So in the context of that structural change, what we were seeing was intensity of competition. So we've had more than 3 years of falling shop prices. We were seeing retailers investing in their digital offer in order to be able to meet the needs of customers. And we were seeing a market that was growing more slowly than it has done historically, and costs that were rising more quickly. So put that lot all together and you have an industry where profitability was falling. So net margins in retail about 10 years ago were about 6 to 8%, and now between 3 and 5. So retailers were already looking at how their business works. What does that mean in terms of the people that work within them? And what we also saw, just in the context of the people that work within retail, is that the incidence of low pay rose. So across the economy as a whole, there were about, in 1990, there were about 15% of people on low pay, which I think we defined as being within 20% of what was the minimum wage, about 15% across the economy 25 years ago. Up to now, that grew to about 20%, and within retail, there were 30% of people 25 years ago on lower pay, and that had doubled over that same period. So the structural change was having an impact on the way that people worked within retail, not necessarily with a good result. Now, what we then saw is, on the back of that structural change, a sort of overlay of the national living wage, and the industry really thinking about what the consequences of that might be. And I think what we wanted to do is to understand that in much more detail. So one of the things that we did was we did a survey of the lower paid, those people within 20%, earning within 20% of the national living wage, to ask them about their motivations, their views of retail. Were they in poverty? Were they on benefits? What was holding them back from progressing? And what was quite interesting is that what we found was that it is the locality and the flexibility of a retail job that people value the most, and pay actually ranked 6th. Now that's not to say that how much people are paid is not important, but it was the community aspect, the interaction aspect of their job that was more important. What we also found was that there were issues around people's ability to progress. So in some instances, some people wanted more hours, and yet other people were being held back because they thought they would lose their flexibility if they were promoted. And that flexibility was more important than progressing within the business. There were people who saw ideas around how to improve productivity, how to do things better within their companies, and that wasn't always necessarily being taken into account. So what we found through this survey was that there are a number of issues that if the industry or individual companies, either individually or collectively, could address more specifically, then actually we would be able to see some shift in the trajectory, if you like, that the industry was on in terms of what the future might look like. Now, we were one of those people who were putting out the headlines about there will be fewer jobs in retail in the future, and that was absolutely a function of the impact of the structural change being accelerated by the living wage and not as a function of the living wage itself. Now, I still believe that to be the case. I think, we will see what happens over the next few years, but I think the most important thing for us and what we're doing with the retailers that we're working with is to work out if there are fewer jobs, how can we ensure that they are better jobs? And that takes us back to the findings of the survey and really trying to identify where the pinch points are and what the things are that will actually enhance productivity, that will reduce turnover in retail, turnover of people, which is quite high. That means you get better return on the training that retailers invest in. Those are the sorts of things that we're working with the HR directors on. And just coming back to sort of Connor's thing about increasing prices, I think it is quite interesting that that's come up as the sort of main response in your survey, because certainly from a retail point of view, that is not what's happening at the moment because of the intensity of competition. We are still seeing falling shop prices, and what retailers are saying as of now is that they are looking mostly at cost savings in other parts of the business. They are looking also at initiatives that do impact labour costs. That is predominantly around reducing differentials across different parts of their pay structures, and to a degree, which is probably a small degree, but it's the bit that's got all the headlines, actually looking at the sort of amending some of their legacy contracts associated with Sunday premiums and overtime, etc., where they've got a whole series of different contracts with different people who started at different times within the business. And we could probably debate all day whether that was caused by the implementation of the living wage or by the structural change that was going on. I'll stop there.
Very good. Thank you very much, Helen. We're pausing on this point about, so the survey that we've done is obviously of all kinds of employers in all sectors,
Yeah.
but clearly the structure of competition in each given market will determine the degree to which profits, prices, or indeed jobs take the strain, and that is very different in different sectors of the economy. Now, Jonathan, you had the joy of becoming the kind of one of the public intellectuals during the referendum campaign. That went very well for you. You even allowed people to call you an expert at various times, which is like life endangering in large parts of the country. So it's good of you to come out in public again today. So before the 23rd of June, we all said kind of confidently the big change to the British labour market over the next 5 years is the national living wage. We now have at least one other one that is competitive at that. Why don't you get on the limb and tell us what is going to happen over the next 4 years?
I think the problem, of course, with answering that question is that Brexit, at least in the short term, is a quintessential macro shock. In the short term, its impact is likely to be on variables like confidence, primarily because nothing is changing, right, for the foreseeable future. We're very bad at foreseeing the future at the moment. But what we can say is that legally and in policy terms, relatively little will change in terms of laws, regulations, etc. For the short term. So for the short term, Brexit is a quintessential macro shock. It's clearly hit confidence already, and via that channel, it's likely to hit demand, hence investment and hiring. Whereas the national living wage, of course, is a microeconomic change, a structural change to the way the labour market works. And economists are pretty bad. We have lots and lots of good microeconomists, especially working on labour market issues in this country. We have some macroeconomists, but
I told you they don't like experts.
10 plus or
Sounds like
So you don't mention Brexit, we'll get through it. It'll be fine.
Brexit.
Choose a euphemism.
The Brexit is behind you.
Right, okay, very good.
National living wage is quintessentially a structural change to the structure of the labour market. And economists are quite bad at relating the two. But fortunately, it occurs to me, we do have actually quite a good recent example of precisely this debate. And that is what's been happening in the Eurozone over the last few years, where the stated policy of the Commission and the Eurozone policy makers in general has very much been that fiscal consolidation, austerity, in other words, a condition of reductions in demand, a demand shock as it were, has gone alongside efforts at structural reforms of various kinds, including in particular abolishing or cutting minimum wages in some countries and also other methods to free up the labour market as well. And the Commission line has been very much that that those two are complementary, that structural reform, in other words, can help mitigate the impact of a demand shock. On the other side, a number of economists, most vociferously Paul Krugman, have argued that this gets the macroeconomics precisely wrong, that structural reforms are at best neutral, and in certain circumstances may actually be quite negative in the circumstances of a demand shock. So, what does that tell us about the impact of the national living wage? Well, the national living wage, at least in neoclassical economics terms, is a negative structural reform, right? It's the opposite of reducing minimum wages. It's the opposite of making it easier to adjust your paying conditions of your workforce in the way that neoclassical theorists would like. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether that's a sensible way of thinking, but let's run with that for a moment and regard the national living wage as a negative structural reform. In that case, well, the empirical evidence, such as it is so far, is pretty weak to support the Commission's line. In my view, it doesn't go so far as to support Professor Krugman's line that structural reforms are positively a bad idea in demand shock circumstances, but it certainly doesn't suggest that they can help you alleviate the effect of the demand shock. Switching that on its head, and we've seen that in a number of places. So, switching on that its head, what does that tell us about Brexit? I think it says that actually, if anything, whatever negative effects there would be from the national living wage and job will, if anything, tend to be mitigated or alleviated in conditions of depressed demand. In other words, we should perhaps worry less about the impact of the national living wage on jobs than we would if actually the economy was roughly on the equilibrium path. Now that's a rather counterintuitive implication, but actually that is broadly consistent with the evidence, and you can certainly make it consistent with the theory. I will have to think more about it, because I only thought about that the last few hours. But I do think that that is a way, at least, of bringing the macro and the micro together in the framework. And I think also if we drill down, we can see, again, further reasons why that might be the case. Now, it's clearly true, as Connor has pointed out.
Saying that this is the law, and they go, oh, is it? And we're talking about smaller businesses, less HR functions, that kind of stuff. So there is like a lot of prongs to how you deal with that.
Jonathan?
I heard, can I just say, from a headhunter actually, before Brexit kind of blew any sense out of the political process entirely, that the Home Office and BIS have created a joint post which they're currently advertising for. I think it is called Head of Labour Market Enforcement. A new position.
Well, as long as that person is incredibly productive.
Yeah.
And they can not only clean the 10 bedrooms, but enforce every bit of labour market regulation, then we're sorted. So let's hope they get someone. I hope it was a good headhunter person.
The headhunters contacted me as well, so if there's anybody in this room who thinks they might be qualified for that job, please let me know and I will pass their name on.
This is meant to be a panel discussion, not a job.
Well, I'm doing my bit to
Okay,
grease the wheels of the labour market. But more generally, I mean, I agree with Kaylee. The main problem in this country is not, of course, there are evil, exploitative employers who are just breaking the law or deliberately exploiting people. But that is not the main problem with the labour market. The main problem is that in particular, the law and regulation around self-employment is a mess. I think there are two reasons why a review is needed. One is this sort of growth of these very areas. I mean, I think Uber is the classic example of something where it's actually beginning to have a macro level effect. It's not just around the edges. I'm a great fan of Uber, but I find it very difficult to accept that the fiction that Uber is only an app rather than a service that a company that provides a service to you, the end customer, and that your only relationship is with the driver via this app, which has no employees effectively. That seems to be a legal fiction which is unsustainable if we want to have anything like the social labour market. Second reason why I think there's an issue here is that if we do eventually end up with some sort of immigration system which is neither the current one of complete free movement for EU workers nor a non-discriminatory system where EU workers are treated the same as non-EU workers. In other words, we end up with some sort of limitations or regulatory restrictions on free movement. That is going to make labour market enforcement far more complicated if we want it to work.
So basically, we should all become, anyone who wants to retrade, it's trade negotiators or labour market regulators, and you are in the money for the next 15 years. I mean, we're running training courses at the Resolution Foundation to do that. Right, let's get one more set of questions in. There was a lady at the back. Who was that?
Sorry, Belinda Johnson from Workland. It's just picking up on the point about 10% of the retail workforce also being supported by benefits. I wondered if that was a retrospective figure or whether that was a current state figure based on the fact that we now have the national living wage in place. I guess my question is if the rationale for the government putting national living wage in was that employers should pay a fair wage and not be propped up by government paying in-work benefits, is the British Retail Consortium or any other trade bodies actually tracking the extent to which that is actually playing out? So is accommodation of the national living wage actually playing out in terms of a fall-off in the need for in-work benefits as the government intended?
Short answer to that is no. But we can come to a long answer to it. So, anyone else for questions?
Yeah, Mike Roberts, I'm a senior counsellor in local government. Interesting discussion. One of the things when I was on the bus this morning to the council offices at 6:30 a.m., most of the bus had people working in the residential care sector. We need something like 86,000 new people working in the residential care sector in the next 5 years. According to a report last week in The Guardian about one of those reports, which was buried by Brexit, the majority of people losing out are women in relationship to the George Osborne living wage, as well as the disabled, notwithstanding the effect on people at the margin in relationship to poverty. So is the George Osborne living wage actually making women and the disabled worse off?
What do you mean
happens
what do you
to
mean
the
by
residential care sector?
What do you mean by losing out?
Losing out, i.e. their level of disposable income with the George Osborne living wage is actually worse with it than it was before without it.
Okay. Right, anyone else? There's one in the middle.
Hi, it's Paul Sellers from TUC. I think for most of this discussion we've been assuming that government holds steady. And one thing you can't
I don't think
assume
anybody in life is assuming that.
That's one thing you can't assume at the moment. So I guess my question is, if we want to see the economy go forward so that it can afford higher wages, are there things that government can do to help that process? I think forward investment, I suppose.
Okay. Great. Right, let's get into those questions. So now, Belinda, your question, and Paul, Jonathan, do you want to come into this? So the question is basically when George Osborne announced the national living wage, he said we were going to have a higher minimum wage and to cut benefits at the same time because it was about time firms coughed up and not the state. That had got claps on the far left and it got some claps on the far right. As I said, our view is it doesn't hold a lot of water, but what's your view?
It doesn't hold a lot of water.
Excellent.
That's not rocket science. It's a unanimous
What do
view
you mean?
between.
You've got a lot of reports.
Yes. Well, no, but you, the IFS, everybody agrees. The overlap between the national living wage recipients and benefit recipients is not complete for the various reasons that Paul outlined. Of course, benefits and tax credits in particular are designed to boost the incomes of low-paid people with high expenditure because of either housing or childship. There's no way the national living wage anything or national minimum wage augmented in its current form will have any significant will be able to do that on its own. We know that in practice it is not the case that tax credits are primarily a subsidy to employers. They aren't. The incidence of tax credits is primarily to the employee. The benefits do flow through. It is not, for the most part, that employers are using the excuse to pay lower wages. On the point about broader economic issues, well, there's a lot there, but it is clearly one of the beneficial side effects of Brexit is that George Osborne's economically illiterate surplus target has been ditched by everybody, and that what has been the almost unanimous opinion of sensible economists for the last 5 years, which is that when government borrowing rates are at their lowest in recorded economic history, going back to the Babylonian Empire, it is simply insane not to borrow money to finance public investment. Finally, that seems to have percolated through to the likely views of the next government.
But you're 50, you're about 50-50 on that. You're not making mind up. Okay, fine. Paul, we'll come back to your big question in a second. Right, just on this, who benefits most from the national living wage? Mike's question.
It is actually women who are most likely to benefit. That's because they're more likely to be low paid in the first place. But this is, a wage increase that will benefit women a lot. It's also younger workers, those 55 and over, as well as older workers. And I think the one way in which people are worried that they might end up worse off is if they're really reliant on those kind of perks like store discounts, but as we've said, it doesn't seem to be one of the major responses that employers are taking. So overall, this, it should be a net benefit for lots of people, but obviously the support from tax credits and universal credit is really key to making sure that living standards for those types of families are supported. And then for disabled employment, if we want to see the employment rate keep rising and rising, then we do have to start looking how can we support disabled people who are trying to get into work. What are the levers the government can pull to try and support that? So.
Very good. Now, Paul, on your rather massive question on does the government hold steady, I think everyone will have their views on that. It's quite a big question, but just one really specific thing. There is a clear political versus economic trade-off on this question of when we resolve what our trade, migration, what is our approach to this Brexit negotiation? Because on the economics, clearly, the sooner we can tell firms what the trading and migration relationship they are going to be operating with, the better for them making investment decisions, because at the moment they're just holding off because we can't give them a straight answer. But there's a trade-off there, which is all negotiation theorists will tell you, as soon as you tell the European Union, as soon as we put in Article 50, we are then in a weaker negotiating position, and that is a brutal, straight trade-off. And whoever the new Prime Minister is going to have to take a pick amongst the other many difficult decisions they're going to have to take. Who knows? Is there anything you want to add?
I'm just sort of agreeing. I think that because certainly from a business point of view, that uncertainty is bad. So anything that Mr Osborne or whoever his successor may be, assuming he has one, can do that will incentivise people to actually continue to invest, I think will be important. And certainly from a retail point of view, that's about ensuring that they continue to invest in digital, given the change that I've talked about, enabling them to continue to invest in physical space, which takes you down their sort of business rates argument. And we, for example, were one of the bodies that sent him a nice little note last week to suggest that actually the change in corporation tax is not such a good idea. It's and that actually, if they wanted to do something that will incentivise investment at local level more beneficially, then they should be looking at investing that money in reducing business rates, not in reducing corporation tax.
In fact, you could do almost anything, and it would be better than cutting corporation tax. I've not heard one single business ask for a cut of corporation tax for at least 5 years. They're a bit like, it's getting embarrassing. We don't actually need to be like the Bahamas. Somewhere between the Bahamas and like the Soviet Union would do us on corporate tax rates. Anyway, right. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you for taking your time this morning. This is not like a debate that is about to go away. So in different forms, in different ways, the impact of Brexit on the labour market over the next 5 years turns out is going to be a massive experiment, and we shall find out what happens. Have a good day.
Accept the broad projections that Nisha and others have done about the negative impacts of Brexit on growth and hence on real wages, then the level of the national minimum wage will be lower. That's arithmetic. But it's still going to be 60% of the average wages. So in a sense, that doesn't tell you anything. It's the relativities, it's the distributional impacts that matter as to whether the national living wage has more of an effect than it would have in normal times, or less of an effect. And what can we say about that? Well, it's quite difficult at the moment, but just on first inspection, my instinct is to say that actually the distributional effects are likely to mitigate the impacts of the national living wage. The national living wage, the Brexit, and in particular the short run, are likely to be bad for the financial sector. They're likely to be bad for London. These are areas where the national living wage has less of a bite, for obvious reasons. Equally, Brexit in the short term may not be so bad for some sectors that benefit from a sharp fall in the exchange rate. The most obvious of this is tourism, hospitality, and so on. That's an area where actually there's quite a lot of national living wage level employees. Similarly, in the short term, I would expect the impact of Brexit on demand and hence perhaps wages and labour demand in manufacturing to be quite positive. The long-term impact on investment, the impact on investment and the future investment hence on new jobs may be negative. But in the short to medium term, it might actually be quite positive. So, overall, I think the experience of recent recessions and recent demand shocks has tended to be that they certainly don't exacerbate inequality. They may have some inequality-reducing impacts. And to the extent that they reduce the demand shock recession, reduces inequality in the wages, you reduce the marginal impact of the national living wage. Now, of course, that may not be the way it actually looks in practice. If the marginal impact of the national living wage is minus 100,000 jobs when the economy is doing fine, that may actually be less of a worry than it is if it's minus 30,000 jobs when the economy is already, and employment are already doing quite badly because of Brexit. But I think on a first pass, I cannot see any particular reason to think that the impact of the national living wage will be magnified by the short-term demand impacts of Brexit, and I can think of some reasons why they may actually be mitigated. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. So the heart of the debate Jonathan's talking about there is the decisions that the Low-Pay Commission is going to have to make in October about next April's national living wage rate, where the current stated position of the LPC and kind of the government is a straight line increase to 60% of median earnings by 2020. And there's then a decision to be made about your view. Jonathan's just given us an optimistic take on what Brexit means for that path that it takes. So that is some of the debate we're going to get into over this summer. No one was expecting the summer this year. And then some of them for the years ahead. Now, We have microphones, we have hopefully questions from you, and the deal is quick questions and then some quick responses to get to everybody. Wonderful.
John Bryant from Harrow. One of the slides earlier talked about most employers actually putting up prices as their first reaction to the national living wage. The impact of exchange rate changes also means that there'll be inflationary pressures from imported goods. And therefore the impact of inflation for the first time perhaps for several, even a decade, will have an impact on the purchase power of people on low incomes. And that impact has not been reflected in any of our contributions this morning. So what is the impact of inflation on people on low incomes?
Good question. Let's just mention next to that.
Hi, Duncan Brown from IES. I'm interested in your views on why business and the business lobbies seem to be so negative on anything that improves employee conditions and pay. Because I mean, we had exactly the same scare stories about this as we've had when the original living wage was introduced, and yet, as you're showing, the effects are relatively benign, and what employers are looking for, as your CIB data shows, is security. That's what's going to give motivation higher productivity, and yet even with this they seem to be working in the opposite direction. So I'm interested in your views in why business seems to be...
Good question. One more? Bill?
Just a comment on Jonathan's aspect. The theory would suggest if demand goes down, you've got fixed wages, you get a bigger fall in employment. And that's what we saw in the financial crash, where the low-skilled workers fell more than elsewhere. And also, on the other side, the employment record of all the people suffering the most from austerity at the moment in Europe is much, much better than in the UK and anywhere else across the But my big point is about, it seems to me from the referendum that the issues are essentially about poverty, worklessness and public services. And we know from the IFS that the national living wage, whatever it does, is not very good in terms of poverty. So what about freezing the national living wage and unfreezing out-of-work benefits?
That's one for the government. Right, there's a lot of questions there. So first of all, this price rise is driven by the national living wage, and price rise is driven by sterling's depreciation, which is currently a bit over 10%, and most people expect to be a large depreciation over time, although that depends on your views about how exchange rates develop. There's one there's one almost absolute certainty for Brexit, which is in the short term, higher prices, some form of inflation shock, depending on how it manifests itself based on sectors competition and level of exposure to international markets. And actually, although you say we weren't talking about that, actually the thing doing the work on that slide showing how the national living wage could be lower is just inflation. Actually, the change in nominal wages from most of the forecasts on Brexit is pretty small, not least because we don't know is the honest answer, whereas we do have a good hunch that inflation's likely to be higher. We've done numbers showing kind of 3-4%, but other people have got different numbers. That anything like that will have a hit on the bottom of, actual living standards across the board, probably. Clearly, being hit when you're on a lower income is harder than being hit when you're on a higher income. And there's one thing I want to say, which is, actually there is a parallel of this, which there was an inflation spike right at the beginning of the financial crisis. Actually, a large part of why we've all said there's this big earnings squeeze over this kind of 10-year period as a whole is because there was in 2009. Do you remember, we had this hilarious thing where we were all panicking that inflation was totally out of control, and then about a week later we were all panicking that there was no inflation, and where was it going to come from? Which shows you maybe just don't panic in life. Now, do you want to add anything to inflation?
The inflation resulting from an exchange rate fall reduces wages. But that's part of the idea. That's the exchange rate acting as a shock absorber. it's painful, but the fact is that if we're poorer, somebody's got to take the hit, and actually doing it through the exchange rate and hence boosting exports, cutting imports, and reducing real wages is in general regarded as sharing the pain rather better than if you have a fixed exchange rate when the pain is likely to fall much more heavily on employment.
Yeah.
So this is not a bug, it's a feature. It's yes, there's pain, but actually the pain will probably be somewhat less for the poorest. Bill's point's an interesting one, and we don't have time to go into this debate in more detail. But I think part of the point as it relates to this is that if you have a relatively high wage that actually bites, that in itself props up demand relative to what would happen if employers could actually cut wages, and that, in circumstances of demand efficiency, is a good thing.
Okay, that's definitely not getting that debate. But right now, Duncan's question was entirely not loaded. It's an open view about. The phrase was, "Why is business so negative about everything?" So can you give us some positivity?
So I will start by saying that, perhaps I didn't explain myself very well when I made my opening remarks. So I am not, the BRC's look at what might happen to the numbers of people who work in retail in the future is not a function of the national living wage. It is a function of the structural change that is going on within the industry. That is about the investment in technology, the fact that between 15 and 20% of what we buy online, the fact that actually if that continues to grow at 10 to 15% a year, which it at the moment is doing, that there will be less physical space within retail because the cost of being able to run that will become prohibitive, and the model will be fundamentally shifted. And so the need to improve productivity, to enhance the profitability across is already there. So in the context of the national living wage, I mean, pretty much every single chief executive that I talk to is supportive of the concept of the living wage, is concerned from the point of view of how, not necessarily what's happened this year, but the trajectory of it and what they might need to do within their business over the next 5 years in the lead up to 2020. So it's much more about the implications of structural change that's causing a concern, not a negativity about the living wage. And in fact, the statistics I quoted earlier about the incidence of low pay, I think there is a recognition, I think, among a lot of people within retail that actually, that trajectory is the wrong one. It's not the one that we want to be on. We want to actually shift that. So
that was very.
I am not negative. The business lobby is.
Robust rather than positive, might be. On this topic, actually, Theresa May this morning, I don't know if anyone's seen her article in the Times, says that she's in favour of workers on board, which is a slightly old-fashioned way of putting it. And this is a policy that Labour leaders for at least 20 years have been definitely scared of. I say for some painful experience, saying they are supportive of. And in the article about it, it has a quote from what is termed an aide. You never in life want to be an aide, something go wrong at that stage. But the aide says, we are sure that businesses are going to be quite supportive of this policy. Now, I don't know who the aide is, but that aide is wrong. But is that different in retail? Do you think retailers are going to be enthusiastic about having workers, or whatever you want to call it? We'll probably want to call it employees on their boards.
I don't know. I think it'd be interesting. I think if you look at some of the models of retail, so whether everybody quotes the John Lewis Partnership, for example, as a sort of cooperative model, the co-op itself is reinventing itself in terms of how its business actually operates. So I haven't asked them if is the answer to that question.
We'll do it if
Yeah, be interesting to see what they say.
Okay, that was very positive. Right.
Just as a follow-up to that one, the work that we did in September and January with the CIPD, we did talk to a lot of employers, and some of them had just ploughed on ahead. They made up their mind about what they were going to do and stuck to it. But some had actually asked their workers, especially on that issue you mentioned of differentials and how to handle depression, what would you find best or maybe least of the actual goal in changing these things? So I think it was mixed. Basically, they think they took some narrowing of differentials. I think that was kind of accepted. but with a bit more emphasis on here's how we build your skills over time. Again, how this all plays out.
Well, and I think that, I mean, that just highlights what we found in our research is that people sort of, people, obviously not people in this room, but people sort of treat those who are on lower pay as a sort of homogeneous kind of bunch of people, whereas actually what we found is that there are those that want cash today because they're young, just entering the workforce, they've got a career to build, or they're getting money as a student, and there are others at different stages in their life career or with different motivations that want different things. So it's how do you sort of personalise that to individuals as opposed to have a one-size-fits-all.
Great, well, let's get another set of 3 questions. One right at the front here, Natalie, and then Rob in the middle.
Paul Nicholson, Secures 2000 Trust and Taxpayers Against Poverty. In 1999, I gave £100,000, commissioned the Family Budget Unit to research the minimum income required for healthy living. I took the research to Unison and London Citizens, who persuaded Ken Livingstone to launch the living wage, the living wage for London in 2004. The principle on which it was based was human need. The name stolen by Osborne has absolutely no connection with human need at all. From the beginning, the housing market has driven the coach and horses through the living wage, because it isn't just about the overall market or the things that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
It's about what's left to buy food, clothes, fuel, transport, and other necessities in the pockets of the poorest people in work and in unemployment.
Paul, can you come to a question?
I've got just to say a bit more, because the Citizens Advice Bureau produced a report on Friday evening, on the impact of council tax. And it showed that 58% of people, mostly in work, who are being forced to pay council tax out of their benefits now, are actually having to choose between council tax, food, and eating. I would like to suggest, as somebody who is fascinated by economics and would like to be able to do more in the field, that the retailers are being done out of a very substantial amount of income by the impossible and chaotic housing market, taking far too much money out of the pockets of particularly the poorest residents, and indeed by the council tax and its enforcement, which adds £125 to the cost when you take, but I think the court, £3.5 million last year, and particularly when they put in the bailiffs of our £4 million. So please look at the consequences of debt on the people who are paying the national
Great.
wage.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Finnegan from Charity Finance Group. I appreciate that this event is mainly looking at private sector and employers as businesses. But when I see the results from the survey, which said that employers are cutting profits or taking money from their profits, it's one of the things that just doesn't seem to ring true for my sector, because there are no profits from which charities can take that from. Charities employ 841,000 people, which isn't a small number, and the majority are in health and social care, and we know that charities make on average, large charities make on average 11% loss on public service contracts. So I suppose that's kind of a reflection and a question for you about, are you planning any more work around looking at different sectors and how they'll be impacted? Because one of the things that's clear from the panel today is that it is different across different sectors, and we can't look at this as some kind of one-size-fits-all, as somebody on the panel said.
Great, so one more question.
Hello, it's Sarah O'Connor from the FT. I thought it was interesting that one of the kind of main ways in which employers say they're going to respond is asking workers to do more. And that kind of tallies with some of the employers I've talked to, particularly the smaller ones, who say things like, they're not going to invest in training particularly, or technology, but a hotel owner will ask a chambermaid to clean 10 rooms an hour instead of 8. And my question is all productivity good productivity? Like, should we welcome this? Or, productivity will go up, but at what cost?
Very good, great question. Okay, right, so Helen, on higher housing costs and higher council tax bills, particularly for the poor, means less people coming into retailers, which, by the way, Paul, you did an excellent job of getting council tax and other things into a debate about national living wage and our government, which was an impressive campaigning as we went. And do you see any differential people's the volume of confidence at the bottom of the market?
Well, one of the points that we highlighted in our first report, which is the one that picked up all the headlines about the numbers of jobs, was that actually it was less about whether, what that number might be and more about the impact on more vulnerable communities, more vulnerable people, and sort of picking up perhaps on the last point on different types of business, particularly smaller types of business.
Yeah. So
I think, just going back to what Jonathan was saying at the beginning as to whether it's Brexit or whatever, my concern is that the people and the places where the most negative impacts are likely to be felt are the places less able to support those kind of impacts.
Yeah.
So, and can I just pick up on the other point that this gentleman made, just on levels of whether it's national living wages or living wages. I think what was interesting to us from a retail point of view is the proportion of people on lower pay in retail who were in poverty. So we looked at the crossover between those that were taking benefits and those that were on low pay. And actually, in the totality, there's 3 million people who work in retail, and across those 3 million people, it is 10% of those people who are actually on benefits. So the idea that everybody on low pay is in poverty, now I'm not making a comment to the gentleman with the blue tie about whether the living wage is or isn't a good idea, but I'm just making an observation just about that we just need to be careful again about this sort of generalisation that low pay and poverty are the same thing.
And just briefly, Paul, on your living wage question, on living wage, there'll be a report out from the Resolution Foundation at the end of this month on the future of the living wage, the one you support. Right, okay, do you want to say anything else on this point about benefits?
Yeah, and thanks for the plug for our research. It's always a nice thing for somebody else to raise instead of me. Yeah, I mean, in this, I think what we've got to consider is the kind of double whammy of kind of low pay and then security, particularly looking at housing. If you've not got a reliable income, getting a private rented tenancy, getting a mortgage, almost out of the question for a lot of people, particularly in really highly competitive housing markets. Also in terms of debt, like what we see at Citizens Advice is people not being able to use traditional debt repayment offers around like a monthly repayment thing, in terms of they can't actually guarantee that they're going to have enough money each month to pay that back. So actually they're having to go to more extreme methods of paying off debt, like insolvency, bankruptcy and debt relief orders, that kind of stuff. And these kind of things can have a big impact. So I think you're absolutely right in terms of looking across different types of people, different types of workers needing different things. What we've got to be careful about is the confluence of these factors falling on one particular group, or many factors falling to certain people and then their experience.
Colin, on this different sectors and different responses, which is quite well made.
Yeah, it came up more in our previous work where we did get into some of those sectoral questions, and I did speak to some charities, and they said, we hear other employers talking about prices or profits and just not available to us. So they were a bit more interested in the productivity enhancing responses, or just fundraising more and thinking about how can we get more money coming through the door. But the set of questions there are very different, and so the answers will be totally different as well. Social care is another really good point, and we've done a lot of work highlighting how even the social care precept, which is meant to bring in a bit more money to help fund this, won't come to the majority of it. So there are much bigger structural questions within those sectors.
It is worth saying that for the new charity world of service delivery, which we are kind of all living with now, although price setting in the normal sense doesn't exist, clearly a lot of these people are tendering for contracts. In the end, social care, for example, in the end is a government set price. They're going to have to put more money in, or they're going to have a bus system. And so the question is, how bad does it get before we get to that point? But we shall see. Now, Paul, on Sarah's question, which is all productivity good productivity? That's rather broad, so maybe just make it about the national living wage and about people cleaning 10 bedrooms rather than 8.
Well, the question of whether it's increased productivity is an important one, right? I mean, you could just clean the bedrooms rather less well. You could write more words, but the average quality of each word might not be so good.
It's nonsense.
So it's not personal.
But then, well, in that case, if you can indeed write more words and they're just as good and get paid more, and we can enjoy your greater output, then on the whole, it's probably a good thing. If we just get a lower quality output, I think the question is whether the market is this just a short-run phenomenon, or does in time the market adjust? That is, people get fed up with hotels where the rooms aren't cleaned properly, they go to others and the market equilibrates. That's what your standard economic model is. I mean, I guess what you're saying is, can we get stuck in some sort of negative equilibrium? Instead of a low pay, low skill, low productivity equilibrium, we get stuck in a somewhat higher paid, higher productivity, but less welfare, less job satisfaction equilibrium. And I think I'll just say that's a very interesting question which I haven't thought about yet. But it's worth very much to think.
I hope not is the answer to that, because I think that you can't, I mean, it took me ages to try and get my head around what productivity actually meant in the real world. I don't know if anybody else in the room perhaps struggled in the same way, but the whole idea that you can, back to your rooms and people cleaning them, I mean, that business, if the rooms are not cleaned better for the customer, so at the end of the day, it's the satisfaction of the person that's doing the job, it's the ability of the business to serve their customers that will drive the sort of broader sense of productivity in terms of how successful that company is, and therefore what the productivity measure at the end of the day might show. So I suppose what I'm saying is, what we should do, the way what we perhaps should think about is a sort of broader definition of productivity that isn't like output per hour or sales per hour. It's about engagement, it's about progression, it's about talent, as well as about the success measures of all that, which is sales or profits. Because you can only get sales or profits if you've got the first.
Okay. Just on this hotels thing. So the hotels is an interesting example because the labour market and how hotels use labour is definitely changing. But just put a slightly more positive twist on it. It doesn't look like what is happening is just people cleaning an extra 20% or 25% of yours. Extra rooms. You've got people being trained to do more jobs within that. They don't want as many staff on totally flexible hours. They're using people who are currently doing just the check-in or just the chamber meeting or just the breakfast thing. You will increasingly see an automation of the check-in, which you're probably already seeing in Premier Inns if you've been to them recently, but then people multitasking between those, and that is partly what they're saying. Partly. Some of it is just what you say, higher volume, but some of it is using people more flexibly across a piece because they've got to, because labour's more expensive. Right, let's get one more set of questions. A set more set of questions right at the front, and then Rob, two in the middle of the round.
Fred Harrison. A question from Ms. Dickinson. Downward pressure of profit margins. Has this been reflected in downward revision of rents, retail rents, and if not, why not?
That's an excellent question. You're giving us an excuse to get into the property market, and as we're British, that's what we like to do.
Robert Appleby from Royal Mail. I was picking on the point Kay made about self-employment and asked really about the enforcement side of the national living wage, whether we're seeing a higher sort of accelerated growth in the minimum based on increasing temptation for trade.
Okay, I've got there was a question at the back behind you. Oh, it's gone. Okay, there you go. Go ahead, Julia.
I mean, given that the obviously budgetary responsibility predicted that there would be 60,000 job cuts as a result of the introduction of national living wage, can you say anything about what it was about the underlying calculations of that figure that hasn't been proved right by events so far?
The swift answer to that is no, we can't. One, they didn't say 60,000 job losses, they said 60,000 less jobs than there would otherwise be with quite a few 100,000 increase. And two, they said it by 2020. So the honest answer is we don't know. All we're saying is there's no evidence of catastrophe yet.
And three, it was a range as well.
And it was a range. So the obviously loves ranges in life. Right, let's get some questions, then we're going to take another set at the back. But right, Fred, downward profits on retail. So this is a really interesting question. It's painful, but let's get into it. So last week, at least 3 or 4 different commercial property investment funds closed their books to their investors redeeming them because of the anxieties about falling property values lead to people wanting to remove money from the funds, and because these funds are invested in real lumpy things called buildings, they can't get that cash quick enough, and so they close it to stop a downward spiral occurring. Now, the interesting thing that you all give us your view on is, from our perspective, there was some evidence that retail property in particular, for the structural reasons that Helen's raised, was overvalued in Britain already, and that an adjustment was coming at some stage, and it looks like Brexit may have brought forward that adjustment to commercial property values to now, which is why these funds are having problems now. The regional people can disagree about that. It might be that people just think Brexit's really scary and they want out of lumpy property. But has retail margins hit retail property prices?
Not fully, I think. So whether you think it's a good or a bad thing, the flexibility in the labour market means that you can move it in terms of, from a business point of view, if you want to increase or decrease your work. That's a relatively easy thing to do. The problem with the property market in this country is that it is inflexible. So most retail leases are on 5-year terms with upward-only rent reviews. Now, that is starting to change a little bit, so leases are becoming a little bit shorter. So 10 years ago, people would end, or 20 years ago, people would enter 25-year leases, and it was very difficult to get out of them. Whereas now it is slightly easier, but they are still fairly long, so you're making a fixed commitment for a period of time, and the ability to, for that rental to be set to a new market rent, particularly if it's lower, is limited because of an upward-only clause in your lease. So, so the answer to your question, has rents reflected what is actually happening? No, it hasn't. It has in some areas, because again, what the structural change is doing is meaning that more of the demand is being focused on the places that are more economically viable. So in terms of the leases that people will be coming out of, they are more likely to be in the more vulnerable and deprived areas, which again will sort of accelerate the pace of change that we're talking about.
Good.
And can I just add my, because I've got my policy team at the back and he'll shoot me if I don't make, because the other thing about property is the tax on property, which is business rates, which is our other favourite subject. Which basically, so property in this country is overtaxed higher than anywhere else in the G7, and that commercial property. Sorry, commercial property, and that is another disincentive to operating physical space.
It looks very happy, so at least someone's happy today. Right, self-employment.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of work at Citizens Advice on bogus self-employment and other forms of kind of like getting around different things like pension contributions, minimum wage being another one, national living wage obviously there too. I think there is obviously more money going into enforcement to HMRC, but to be totally honest, the compliance team there have a harder job now. There's so much more variety in terms of the way people work. There's so much more grey in terms of what counts as employment, worker or self-employed, and determining those kind of statuses around employment status where somebody actually falls is a harder task. There is an argument to say that with enforcement you also need clarity on the side of the regulations and the side of the rules and legislation, and we do have some way to go on that, to be totally honest. Trying to explain to a client, you know, like I have done over the years, okay, you're self-employed, you're a worker, you're employed, is near impossible, let alone then saying, okay, the implications of that is that you've got this right to sick pay or this right to redundancy pay, whatever it may be. So I think with a much more complex kind of labour market in terms of the way we work now, that becomes a harder task. I'm not sure that enforcement is the only answer. I'm certainly welcoming the money going into it. Bogus self-employment was an issue before that, so any money towards enforcement on this is welcome. But there does need work. We do need work on the legislation as well, I think.
And just on the big picture on this enforcement stuff, because we talk like enforcement, it should happen. We are unusual as a country that we are accidentally delivering our labour market enforcement through our tax authority, which does both the minimum wage, but insofar as there is any enforcement of self-employment and employment rights, it's done through the tax system because that's how we chose to do it. We have almost no enforcement of actual. We have a tiny thing. We have almost no labour market enforcement, i.e. someone whose job it is to say, no, this firm doing this is not, you require either the individual to take the court, which they can't do anymore, or you're required to have a tax issue, at which point some enforcement resources in HMRC get vaguely involved, which is unusual as a country with
How do other people do that?
they have the labour market regulator called whatever you want in different countries that literally has people that they have a very large version of our Gang Masters Licence Authority doing versions of that, and not just for agency workers. And that is just that's a choice we've made as a country about a flexible labour market. One of the benefits was that it was meant to mean we didn't have to have lots of resources on enforcement, except when tax was involved.
Well, flexible is supposed to mean legal though, isn't it, as opposed to
I should
turned out not.
I should add in here as well that, like at Citizens Advice, we see people who are, frankly dodgy employers, who are trying to get away with what they can. But we also see like a huge group of people who are really good employers, but just can't quite work out what they're supposed to be doing in terms of this complexity of rules. So it's again enforcement, legislation, whether it's a stronger enforcer or a wider remit, but also communication about those rights and responsibilities for employers is so key. The amount of people that we end up ending up negotiating